Nice to see you all here today. Thank you for coming. Yes, I do have an extensive background in the Middle East. I lived and worked there on and off for decades. And I spent a great deal of time doing archaeology. There's also some anthropology as well. And my interests in the Middle East are extensive, but not modern politics. I stay away from that. Today's topic, you may wonder why this topic. I belong to a First Parish in Cambridge, and they have a Middle East education group, and on occasion I do a presentation for them. And so this is one that I proposed to them a number of years ago, and I'm happy to do it for you today. Now, Miriam, should I do screen share?
Yes, Robin, go ahead and share
Okay.
your screen.
All right, patience, everybody. Okay. Right, here we are. Pilgrimage and Mystery, Mark Twain and Agatha Christie in the Middle East. So today we're going to consider Western literary figures who viewed and experienced the Middle East through their travels, and we'll focus on the writings of Mark Twain and Agatha Christie, as they were influential writers whose views in the Middle East really continue to shape our perspectives today. Twain went to 19th century Palestine in search of the Holy Land, whereas Christie lived and traveled in the Middle East during the first half of the 20th century, which was the age of British imperialism. Now, we're going to set the stage, spend a few minutes setting the stage for Mark Twain. 19th century Palestine was ruled as an Ottoman Empire province, and the economy was based on rural agriculture. The population was predominantly Arab Muslims, but there were also native Christians and an influx of Jews. And at this time, European entities tried to extend their influence in Ottoman Palestine, particularly with regard to the Christian holy places. And it was a destination for Christian pilgrims who were particularly enthusiastic about seeing Jerusalem. So here are a few 19th century pictures of the Western Wailing Wall, sacred to Jews. And here, the 19th century, the Dome of the Rock, which is a major shrine in Islam. And up here, a street scene. Now, at this time, the Protestant way of life was dominant in America, and there was an emerging concept of a holy land, not only as a place described in biblical literature, but a place that you could go and visit. And this became a very popular notion, particularly after the Civil War, when Americans were anxious to travel. Now, in Protestant households, there was usually a parlor Bible, and this was an elaborate work with illustrations and maps and chronologies to give try to give an impression of what the biblical lands were like. The stereoscope was very popular. This was a simple device for viewing Holy Land images in 3 dimensions. Just a sec, I need a laser pointer. There we go. Travel narratives and biblical geographies were written by Americans and available to the reading public in America at this time. And in 1874, there was the construction of Palestine Park in Chautauqua, New York. Now, this still exists. You can go and visit it. Here we have a topographical model of the Holy Land that if you couldn't go and travel to it yourself, you could bring your family here. And here the lake represents the Mediterranean Sea. And then here we have this highland country of Judea and Samaria, today Israel and the West Bank. Here's the Dead Sea. There's a replica of the Jordan River running north of that. And then to the east, the lands of Ammon, Moab, and Edom, which today are in Jordan. And then we have the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. They had a Jerusalem exhibition. So here you have a model of the city of Jerusalem, including a model of the Dome of the Rock next to a Ferris wheel. And The Jerusalem exhibition was populated by 300 natives that were brought from Jerusalem to act out their normal lives at this exhibition. So there were street vendors and beggars and camel drivers and craftspeople all engaging in supposedly what was their normal life. They also brought animals. Now, I'll give you a quick look at a stereoscope. It's a simple device used to view a stereograph. And here's an example of a stereograph, an image in duplicate, that if you put this card in this slot, you could view it in 3 dimensions. So these were really popular with the American public and church groups. Now, in the mid-19th century, the population of Jerusalem was about 17,000, whereas there was some 13,000 to 14,000 pilgrims that came every year, particularly at Easter time. And the numbers over the years were ever increasing. Russian and Eastern Orthodox pilgrims were the most numerous. And here's a picture of Russians being baptized in the Jordan River in the 19th century. These pilgrims traveled to the Holy Land specifically to atone for their sins and prepare for salvation. And most of them were very poor, and they were satisfied with sparse accommodations, and their priests led their groups. Now, in contrast, American travelers at the time were tourist pilgrims. They were from the middle or the upper class, and they were seeking both a religious and a tourist experience. And they had interests in native Palestine and souvenir collection. Now, these people required hotel accommodations, prepared foods, and they typically hired a professional dragoman or tour guide. And here's a photograph by Felix Bonfils, a famous photographer of the time, of a dragoman. And his costume isn't all that far-fetched, actually, although it is a studio photograph. Now, individuals or groups would hire a dragoman who served as general agent. He was a translator, he was a tour guide, but he was also responsible for obtaining horses and tents and other supplies, food, and he had to engage in critical negotiations with the locals, including the Bedouin. So this person was an essential master of all arts. Now, with the steady increase in the volume of pilgrimage to the Holy Land, Western powers tried to pressure Ottoman officials into improving road facilities to encourage more pilgrim movements between the port town of Jaffa and Jerusalem. Now, most of the pilgrims were coming across the Mediterranean by boat and arriving in Jaffa, and then they had to have a difficult journey overland to Jerusalem. But the Ottoman government resisted road improvements. In 1865, the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire stated, "I shall never concede any road improvements to these crazy Christians, as they would transform Jerusalem into a Christian madhouse." Wow. The momentum of the Christian madhouse was unstoppable, and in 1892, a railway was constructed between Jaffa and Jerusalem, which opened the gates for ever more pilgrims. Now, here's a map of the area we're going to be talking about, with the Mediterranean here, Damascus up in the north, and then the Sea of Galilee here, and various sites from the New Testament. Here's the Jordan River, the Dead Sea, and then down here, Jerusalem, Jericho, Bethlehem. Now, there were several Western literary figures who went to 19th century Palestine around the same time as Mark Twain. Among them, William Thackeray made a visit in 1844 and left an account, which is scathing condemnation. In 1850, Gustave Flaubert passed through the gates of Jerusalem, left only a few sentences which are really not worth repeating. In 1857, Herman Melville went, and he went on an extensive journey that was a journey of spiritual discovery for him. He was very interested in theological questions, and after his trip, he wrote a poem that was 18,000 lines of verse about theological conversation in the context of the Holy Land. It was not a bestseller. And then in 1867, Mark Twain shows up. And the themes that these and other writers in the period intended to focus on were the peoples of Palestine, the landscape, and the Christian shrines. Now, as I said, after the Civil War, Americans longed to travel to Europe and the Holy Land. And at the same time, Protestant biblical imagery dominated American religious life. And these Bibles gave the impression of rich scenes of a fertile, beautiful Holy Land. They were much like visions of a Garden of Eden. And people were really attracted to the notion of a paradise on earth. Now, the first package tour from America to the Holy Land via Europe was by steamship. Here's the steamship, the USS Quaker City. And it embarked from New York on a 5-month cruise that included 3 weeks in the Holy Land. And here's an advertisement sheet from that cruise mentioning the Holy Land, Egypt, the Crimea, and Greece. This was advertised as a luxury cruise, and the participants were vetted for their social standing. And at the time, Mark Twain was an unknown nobody, and the only way he got a ticket was that somebody else had dropped out. Now, he proposed to the Alta California newspaper in San Francisco that they pay his fare, as he had no resources, and that he would then send back dispatches from his travels in Europe and the Holy Land. So the paper paid his fare, which was $1,250 for 5 months. And at the end of the cruise, he compiled the letters he had sent to them to the newspaper, and he published them as the book Innocents Abroad. Now, the cruise ship came across to the Eastern Mediterranean and docked in Beirut, which would be about here on this map, if it was included. And at Beirut, the passengers had a choice. They could get off and travel overland down to Jerusalem, or they could stay on the boat and land at Jaffa and go a much shorter overland version to Jerusalem. And Twain left the ship at Beirut with a half a dozen very enthusiastic pilgrims. And they embarked on an overland journey by horseback to Damascus in Syria. And at the distance, Damascus looked very noble and very intriguing. But Twain was disappointed in it. When he got behind the walls, he found it bleak and cramped. Now, his visit was shortly after the terrible massacre of the Christians of Damascus in 1860. He doesn't really mention this event that I can recall, but he does note that there was a lot of hostility towards Christians still in Damascus at the time. And of course, as a foreigner, he was automatically identified as a Christian. Now, traveling south from Damascus, he and his group enter this territory here, the land of Galilee, which was the land of the ministry of Christ. And at this beginning of this Holy Land adventure, he attempts to identify the natives as living examples of biblical figures. He refers to seeing a great herd of goats and sheep. The shepherds that tended them were the very picture of Joseph and his brethren. But he soon gave up these biblical analogies. And while visiting the Galilean sites of the ministry of Jesus, he found some locations in ruins, including the Capernaum, shown here, a 19th century view of Capernaum. Today, it's all been excavated, reconstructed, there are facilities. It was very different, of course, when he was there. And some of the sites of the New Testament had modern villagers occupying them at the time of his visit. And he describes Magdala villages, thoroughly ugly, cramped, squalid, uncomfortable, and filthy. And as we rode into Magdala, not a soul was visible. Now, Mark Twain was particularly anxious to view the Sea of Galilee, and here are a couple of 19th century pictures of the shore of Sea of Galilee. But in reality, he found it very disappointing. He tells his audience that Lake Tahoe is much better. He and his fellow pilgrims expected much more based on their reading of prior travel accounts and illustrated Bibles with images of this Holy Land paradise. Well, when they were there, they tried to barter for a boat ride upon the sea, but the pilgrims he traveled with refused to pay the asking price. And so there was no boat ride on the Sea of Galilee, and Twain was bitterly disappointed. He had come a very long way only to be disappointed. Now, from Galilee, they traveled to Mount Tabor, which is the site of, in the Bible, is the site of the transfiguration of Christ, where his divinity was revealed to his followers. And after leaving Mount Tabor, Twain commented, "We met all the camel trains and jackass caravans between Jericho and Jacksonville." Now, this is just one example where Twain finds local place names that are not biblical to be incredibly inconvenient, and he wasn't going to bother to learn the Arabic name. And similarly, he and his group, when they traveled in Europe and in the Middle East, they never learned or used the names of their tour guides. They were simply all called Ferguson, which they thought was hilariously funny. Now, they continued from Mount Tabor to Nazareth. Here's Nazareth there on the map. Now, along the way, Twain becomes increasingly disgusted with the occupants of Palestine, particularly with their poverty in their lifestyles. At the same time, he became increasingly annoyed with the often desolate, treeless, and rocky environment. He states engravings of the Holy Land did not show desolation, dirt, rags, fleas, ugly features, ignorance, disagreeable jabbering, and unknown tongues, and the stench of camels. He was not a happy camper. This was a difficult journey for him, and he was unhappy on a number of accounts. He was appalled with the pilgrims he was traveling with for their frantic evangelicalism, but also for their abuse of the animals that carried them. He tried to distance himself from these companions, even though he was on a religious trip himself. He only once refers to himself as a pilgrim. He was also appalled that the pilgrims carried hammers and other tools for what he described as hacking and chipping at monuments, walls, gates, wherever they are compelled to pry out and pocket a piece of their Bible history. And they had started this when they were traveling in Turkey, and they got into trouble with the Ottoman government for it. And it continued through the Holy Land and into Egypt. When the group went there, his companions began to chip away at the Sphinx. At one Holy Land location, Twain comments, "We entered a mosque on a traditional site, and the pilgrims broke specimens from the foundation walls, although they had to step upon the prayer rugs in order to do it. It was almost the same as breaking pieces from the hearts of those old Arabs. Suppose a party of armed foreigners were to enter a village church in America and break ornaments from the altar railings for curiosities and climb up and walk upon the Bible and pulpit cushions." He says, "The incorrigible pilgrims have come in with their pockets full of specimens broken from ruins. I wish this vandalism could be stopped." But despite his outrage, Twain began to collect such souvenirs himself towards the end of the tour. And he pictures himself as having joined the Vandals. Now, the first edition of Innocents Abroad was illustrated. It included this illustration of Mark Twain as an American Vandal. And to distinguish himself as an American, he's wearing a Native American costume. He has a bow and arrows. He has a tomahawk, but also a suit jacket and a bag that says MTUS on it. Now, describing their vandalism at the grotto of Our Lady in Bethlehem, he states, "We took many little fragments of stone from here. They have the power to subvert barrenness in women. We took many specimens that they might confer happiness upon certain households." Now, the pilgrims that Twain traveled with were deeply influenced by the romantic and sentimental Holy Land travel account of the Reverend William Twain that had been written 10 years before. And Twain knew this work very well himself as well. And in the first edition of Innocents Abroad includes this illustration, which is a satirical cartoon showing the Reverend Twain weeping at the sight of Jerusalem. And here's a picture of Twain dressed in a Turkish costume. And his book, Tent Life in the Holy Land, that was so popular in America. Twain challenges Prime on many accounts. He dismisses Prime's romantic sentimentalism and believes you can be a devoted Christian without bursting into tears at the sight of Jerusalem, which Twain thought was absurd. He dismisses the Reverend Prime's raptures over the beauty of the landscape of the Holy Land, which Twain thought was hideous. And he challenges the assertion that violence was necessary and desirable when traveling in the Holy Land. And here he pictures a gun at the feet of the Reverend Prime. Prime was always looking for a fight with Arabs, particularly the Bedouin. He enjoyed firing his gun. He relished drama and wanted to demonstrate American superiority by waving his arms around and threatening to use them. Twain thought that was entirely unmerited. So he felt that Prime's account was unrealistic. But the pilgrims he traveled with were devoted to Prime's account, and they tried to imitate him in every way. And they waved weapons about and threatened to scalp Arabs. Now, Twain and his party finally arrived in Jerusalem, which of course is filled with Christian holy shrines that were controlled by the Greek Orthodox and the Roman Catholics. Now, here's a picture of the 19th century of the Via Dolorosa, which is the way that Christ traveled while bearing the cross. And here's a 19th century photograph of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where it is believed that Christ was crucified, buried, and resurrected. Now, Protestant Americans at this time would visit these places, but they would sometimes doubt their authenticity. They didn't trust the Greek and Latin churches. I'm going to show you here a floor plan of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, just to show you how densely packed it is and how compartmentalized and crowded it is. And this is a space that to this day is shared by various Christian sects: the Roman Catholic, the Greek Orthodox, the Syrian Orthodox, the Armenian Orthodox, the Coptics, and the Ethiopians. They all have stakes in this building. There's a long history of conflict among these sects. Protestant visitors were outraged by the disputes and by the fact that Ottoman soldiers were stationed at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to break up fights among the clergy. And they were also outraged by the fact that Muslim families kept the keys to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and other Christian shrines. And that continues to this day because the Christian sects would continue to go to war with one another over the keys. So they are kept by Muslim families for everybody's safety. Now, this slide shows just a little glimpse of a corner of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre today. And here also a glimpse of the corner of the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem today. And on display in the 19th century is, as today, were candles and glitter and incense and pictures of saints and gilded lamps and statuary in great quantities of ornamentation. And to Protestants, these features provoked suspicion and accusations of idolatry. Twain referred to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as the most sacred place on earth to millions and millions of people. the most illustrious edifice in Christendom, with all its claptrap sideshows and unseemly impostatures of every kind. And here he says, the place is scandalized by trumpetry, gewgaws, and tawdry ornamentation. In referring to the Church of the Nativity, Twain says, the grotto was tricked out in the usual tasteless style observable in all the holy places of Palestine. As in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, envy and uncharitableness were apparent here. The priests and the members of the Greek and Latin churches are compelled to approach and retire by different avenues, lest they quarrel and fight on this holiest ground on earth. And this picture up here is a picture of Israeli soldiers breaking up a fight at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre that was about 4 or 5 years ago. And about every 4 or 5 years, there's a big fight that makes it into the international news. Now, in 1867, American and British Protestants created an alternative place in Jerusalem for the contemplation of the death and the burial and the resurrection of Christ. And this is called the Garden Tomb. And at this site, they built a lovely garden around a tomb from the Roman period. And here's the tomb here. Now, archaeologists have shown that this cannot be dated to the time of Christ. But Protestants continue to accept this site as a suitable for the venue for the veneration of Christ. And it is a lovely place. It's just very meditative, contemplative, and very beautiful and quiet. Twain did not visit the Garden Tomb. I don't think it was ready and open to the public at the time of his visit, because he spent about 10 days in Jerusalem and he visited every holy shrine he could find multiple times. So it's pretty clear to me that he never went there. Now, we'll take a quick glance at some of the 19th century people of Palestine. Early in his travels, Twain refers to Arab Muslims as an oppressed race, suffering the inhuman tyranny of the Ottoman Empire. The people are very poor, and yet they are ground down by a system of taxation that would drive any other nation frantic. These people are naturally good-hearted and intelligent, and with liberty and education would be a happy and contented race. But many of the encounters that Twain experienced with the natives were in the countryside, which had been ravaged by famine. And he soon found the inhabitants unattractive, dirty, ill-mannered, and beggarly. At one biblical site, he notes, here are the wildest hordes of half-savages we have found thus far. In 5 minutes, a begging, screeching, shouting mob was struggling about our horses, blocking the way. In the Jezreel Valley, he met Bedouins he described as whooping and fluttering their rags in the wind and carrying on in every respect like a pack of helpless lunatics. As for village Arabs, he basically compares them to Native Americans, whom of course he calls Indians, and says, well, you just want to exterminate the whole tribe. So he had very little patience for these people. I'll do a couple pictures from the 19th century. Here are women at a well in the town of Ashkelon. Ashkelon is located on the south coast of Israel. Here are men from Gaza, also on the south coast. Here's a Christian woman from Bethlehem, and a typical photograph of Jewish men in Jerusalem. Now, Mark Twain published Innocents Abroad, or The New Pilgrim's Progress, in 1869. As I said, it was an illustrated work. We've seen some of those illustrations. Here's the vision of a tourist with sunglasses and a umbrella and a donkey. And here is an Arab bride. Now, if we look at the influence of Innocents Abroad, he sold 70,000 copies in the first year of publication, and that's 1869. That's pretty amazing. It was a bestseller for Twain. It made his name in America. For them, he was nobody. It was the most famous 19th century travel book. It remains the most popular travel book ever written by an American. And subsequent American tourist pilgrims carried the Bible and copies of Innocents Abroad as their guides, and some still do. So you can see that this had a great deal of influence. And to review his goals in writing this book is he wanted to write a realistic account and take on those other travel narratives. He wanted to dismiss romantic sentimentalism and the use of weapons and violence. And he was very concerned to present drama, exaggeration, satire, skepticism. I mean, he wanted shock value. He wanted to entertain and sell as many books as possible. I think we need to take Mark Twain's words with a grain of salt. Themes in Innocents Abroad, disappointment. He didn't find the Garden of Eden. He found a 19th century Ottoman backwater in the throes of famine and poverty. Palestinians did not conform to the behaviors expected of biblical figures. The rural Holy Land sites were generally dismal and uninteresting. And Jerusalem and Bethlehem holy sites were heavily ornamented and fraught with Christian sectarian violence. Throughout the work, he asserts the superiority of white Americans and Europeans, and the superiority of the American landscape, which he draws a lot of comparisons so that his readers will, in a sense, know what he's talking about. Now, Twain's account remains highly controversial to this day. I mean, really the question is, was Twain an authority on 19th century Palestine by virtue of his 3-week excursion? Now, very enthusiastic Zionists and American evangelicals accept him as an expert and point to his observations of a desolate landscape as Twain's prophecy of the future creation of the state of Israel. Now, due to his later fame as a writer and a public figure, he is falsely credited with having deep expertise. Well, regardless about how you feel about that subject, Twain really wasn't an expert. He was unaware of some of the very strong realities and lacked the big picture. He traveled at the end of summer, which is the height of the dry season. If he had gone in the spring, he would have found the landscape carpeted with very beautiful flowers. With the end of the American Civil War, the Palestinian cotton industry nearly collapsed, which ravaged the rural economy. Locust plagues had eaten what little crops there were over the prior 2 years, and failure of that year's harvest meant that famine was a huge issue. And these factors colored his impressions when he was traveling in the countryside. But I will note that there are a number of useful and authoritative works on 19th century Palestine written from a variety of points of view that provide context for the period of Mark Twain's visit. So that's all I'm going to say about Mark Twain. Let's move on to Agatha Christie. Okay. We can look at the ways that her memoir and her life and travels in the Middle East influenced her writing. Now, she wrote several novels based in the Middle East and published them between 1936 and 1951. Now, Agatha's first trip to the Middle East was in 1910 when she visited British Egypt with her mother at the age of 20. Now, she was born Agatha Mary Clarissa Miller, and the Millers were a well-off family, but their fortunes had dwindled, and it was time for Agatha's official social debut. And it was a lot cheaper to send her and her mother to Cairo and have the social debut there than to have it in London. And so they arrived. And she was there for an extended period. She was introduced to 30 eligible young men. She spent her days at picnics, parties, and dances. And she had a very full and enjoyable social life in Cairo and gave no thought to Egyptian antiquities. Her mother tried to get her to go to the museum, and she wasn't having that for a minute, nor was she interested in ruins upon the Nile. So here we have just a photograph of European society in British Egypt and Europeans at that time at Giza. Now, what's really interesting is she wrote her first novel ever while she was on this trip as a very young woman. And she called it Snow Upon the Desert, and she signed it Monosyllaba. Now, this has never been published. You cannot see it. There are no excerpts available. It's locked up in the Christie archives, so I can't tell you anything about it. She did go back 20 years later, by the way, to see the antiquities. So to set the stage here, at the time that Agatha lived and traveled in the Middle East and wrote her Middle East setting novels, British influence was huge. Egypt was a British protectorate. Palestine was a British mandate. Transjordan was a British mandate. Iraq was a British mandate. And Syria, which included Lebanon in those days, was under the French. So this entire territory, the entire central Middle East, is ruled by Western powers. And that certainly made a difference. Now, Agatha and her husband, Archie Christie, were divorced in 1928, which was a huge disappointment to Agatha. And her reaction was to get out of town. So she boarded the Orient Express to Istanbul. She went from there by train to Damascus and then overland to Baghdad. She did this alone as a single woman. That experience influenced her later when she went to write Murder on the Orient Express. Now, when she was in Baghdad, she stayed in Iraq for a very long time, 2 years. She visited Sir Leonard Woolley on his excavations at the Mesopotamian site of Ur in southern Iraq. And she had such a good time and was so taken with that she went back in 1930. And on her second trip to Ur, she met the young archaeologist, Max Mallowan. And Max was younger than her, but they had such a good time together. They enjoyed the same things, had the same sense of humor, and they married, although Max was younger. Married in 1930. So Max went on to direct his own excavations, particularly up here in northeastern Syria. He was interested in the ancient life of Assyria during the Bronze Age. And he excavated sites with names like Nineveh, Shagara Bazaar, Tel Barak, Tel Rapachia, and Nimrud. And Agatha joined him on these excavations. And they lived in the countryside in his a traditional Syrian village, such the sort that she would have been experienced with. Now, they spent 2 years at the excavation at Shagar Bazaar in French Syria. Here's a picture of the excavation. Looks like chaos to me, but they must have known what they were doing. And then here's Agatha here on the site. And here is a photograph of Le Baron Hotel in Aleppo, which was really the only place that Westerners stayed in those days. And there she wrote portions of Murder on the Orient Express. She finished the book at the Para Palace Hotel in Istanbul, which was really the only place Westerners stayed in Istanbul at the time. And then here's a picture of trying to get the vehicle that she and Max owned onto a boat and over the Euphrates River at Raqqa. Now, Agatha was the general manager of the excavation, and she hired and supervised domestic help and the cooks. She arranged meals. She worked at archaeological restoration and conservation. She cleaned artifacts. She mended pots. She labeled exhibits. She took photographs. She developed film. She balanced the books. They couldn't do it without her. At the same time, she wrote a great deal while she was on the excavation, including the excavations at Shagara Bazaar. And she had, my understanding is she had a wooden crate and an old typewriter. She just banged out stories and novels, which was really quite amazing. Now, in 1946, she published a memoir of her life and travels in Syria. Called Come, Tell Me How You Live. And she was becoming very well known as a writer, but she refused all interviews. She never gave interviews. This was her bridge to the public because people would often ask her, well, how did you live in Syria? So this was a way of responding to those questions. It's also the only book she ever wrote that she signed Agatha Christie Mallowan. And she refers to it as a very little book full of everyday doings and happenings. The title, again, resulting from questions people would ask her. And it included chatty little stories about excavation management, travels in the region, staff personalities, shopping experiences. The multi-ethnic work crews. And Max hired Arabs, Turks, Kurds, Armenians, Yazidis, and other groups. It would have been ethnographically fascinating. She mentions petty circumstances of cross-cultural misunderstandings that she found slightly humorous. And she dwells on the limitations of her domestic staff, which she did not find humorous. And to give you a sample from the book, she refers to a night that she and Max spent at the Syrian village of Amuda. No sooner have the lamps been extinguished than mice appear in their scores. I really believe in the hundreds, emerging from their holes in the walls and the floor. They run gaily over our beds, squeaking, mice across one's face, mice tweaking your hair. A mouse is sitting at the foot of my bed, attending to his whiskers. But these were her fondest of memories. Her happiness in Syria is quite evident. She says, I am remembering a little hill all covered with golden marigolds where we had a picnic lunch on one of our holidays. And closing my eyes, I can smell all around me the lovely scent of flowers. Well, it's not surprising that she has fond memories of Syria because she was a privileged Western woman. She was traveling in a country ruled by a Western government. She was afforded all kinds of allowances that were not afforded to Native women. And her husband was a paymaster. So and he was handing out salaries. So he would have been treated like royalty. Now, the 1920s and the 1930s were a period of popularization of archaeology through famous discoveries. And here we have the discovery of the tomb of King Tut in 1922. And Queen Pawabi's gold headdress from the site of Ur in 1928. And the London Illustrated London News published these and many other announcements at the time. And so archaeological settings became popular among novelists, including Agatha. Her first published story set in the Middle East was written in 1923. It's called The Adventure of the Egyptian Tomb. Features her character Poirot. Now, her Middle Eastern works were part of the golden age of classic detective fiction, and not only were audiences fond of archaeological settings, but they really loved the exotic and romantic East. That was quite popular. Now, let's take a look at her books. In 1936, she published Murder in Mesopotamia. Now, the characters in this book are Westerners. They're mostly archaeologists. It's based on it's centered at a fictional archaeological site that was really modeled after the excavations at Ur and includes this map of the excavation compound. And this is where people lived and worked when they were not actually on the archaeological site. And the action takes place here, and one of the team members is murdered. This is a closed setting that she used very well when she wrote her novels about, the country house in England and such. And she wrote this while she was at Shagar Bazaar, and she basically wrote it for Max. And it shows her detailed understandings of the operations of an archaeological project. It was adapted for television in 2002. I have not seen it. In 1937, she published Death on the Nile. And the characters here are Westerners, the tourists viewing archaeological sites. The closed part of the setting is closed, and it says tour boat on the Nile in British Egypt. And the tourists, who include an archaeologist, explore the ruins of Aswan. Agatha knew Aswan because she and Max had made a trip there. And in the story, a young married couple is stalked by a former girlfriend of the groom. And this was made into a movie. I think there were several movies, but the famous one is 1978 film, which if you haven't seen, it's kind of fun. I believe Angela Lansbury is in it. In 1938, she published Appointment with Death, and here the characters are Westerners, they're tourists viewing an archaeological site. The setting at first is in Jerusalem, where this large extended family and various other tourists form a group and they leave Jerusalem and they go to the archaeological ruins at Petra, which is in southern Jordan. And there, the family matriarch is murdered, and it sets the stage for the story. Now, she has one character in this book that is a native Palestinian, but doesn't have very much of a role. She's really focused on the tourists. There was a 1988 film. The film is different from the book. It was set in the archaeological site of Qumran. Now, Qumran is a site very close to where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. It's located on the shore of the Dead Sea in Israel. I have yet to see this one. Now, in 1944, she publishes Death Comes as the End. And the characters here are very different. They're ancient Egyptians, which is really a departure for Agatha Christie. The book is set in Thebes in Egypt in 2000 BC, around the beginning of the Middle Kingdom period. And the story centers around a large aristocratic family and their servants and murders that take place among them. Now, this is really interesting because, you know, all the characters are native to Egypt and therefore what we would call today people of color, which is very unusual for Christie. I think in all of her literature, she has very few people of color. She includes a few Nubian slaves, but they really just appear as props. She doesn't have any sense of Blacks as having any other role in ancient Egypt other than as slaves, which even at that time was known not to be the case. So a television adaptation was announced for 2020. I don't know if that ever happened because, of course, COVID and all that. Now, her last book set in the Middle East, it was published in 1951. It's called They Came to Baghdad. It features Westerners, but there are also two native Iraqi characters in this book, which is unusual. So it's partly set in Baghdad, which Agatha knew extremely well from her travels, as well as setting on a fictional archaeological site. And you know, the plots, there are various plots, and international intrigue and spying, and the heroine's love interest is an archaeologist. Now, the native Iraqis, which is interesting, if you read between the lines, they're both apparently Christian. Agatha never deals with Islam and Muslims, so she just simply doesn't mention anything like that. But the Iraqi woman in the book challenges the assumptions of British imperialism as the inevitable order of the day, which is very unusual for Agatha Christie, who always supported British imperialism as the order of the day and the backdrop of her novels. But They Came to Baghdad was written after World War II, when the British Empire was crumbling. And there was apparently a 2019 miniseries on television. Now, Max was knighted for his archaeological work in 1968, and Agatha became Lady Mallowan. In 1971, she was appointed Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire for her literary work. But she always preferred the title Lady Mallowan. And here's a picture of Agatha and Max in 1970. Agatha died in 1976. Max fairly quickly married his much younger secretary, but he lived a few more years after her. There are two excellent biographies of Max Mallowan, very famous archaeologist. There are biographies of Agatha Christie, of course. I have yet to find one I like. Although Lucy Worsley has just published one. It wasn't reviewed well in the New York Times a few weeks ago. So if we look at the influence of Agatha Christie's work in general, her total body of work, she has sold over 2 billion books. Her work is the most widely published body of work, except for the Bible and Shakespeare. She's the most translated individual author with books in 103 languages, including Arabic. All of her books are still in print. Her works include 66 novels, 14 collections of short stories, 6 romances, and more. And she was, for a time, very popular in the Middle East, particularly in the 20th century. So we see her enduring influence. The ways in which she portrays the Middle East and its peoples have lasting impact as her work is still widely read. And there have been Middle East tours with itineraries that are based on Agatha Christie's novels. And some tourists, use her novels as guidebooks. Now, if we look at themes in Agatha Christie's Middle East mysteries, as we said, it was the golden age of detective fiction, and the Eastern setting was becoming popular. And the books take place in the context of British imperialism and colonialism in the Middle East. The Middle East is represented as romantic, exotic, and wild. The ancient East is an archaeological wonder and a tourist destination for Europeans. But she doesn't really deal with the modern East. That's not as interesting to her, with the exception perhaps of They Came to Baghdad. Now, native society is sometimes presented as uncivilized. Natives have animalistic or childlike characteristics, and they are generally insignificant to the mystery or the solution, with the exception of Death Comes as the End, the book that was set in ancient Egypt. Now, Agatha Christie has been referred to as an imperial feminist, and by which they mean is that she'll have characters who are independent young women. They're single, and they just pack up and go to the Middle East and pursue their careers. And yet she has nothing to say about Native women. With the exception of They Came to Baghdad, they don't figure in her book at all. She has no interest in them. Now, Twain and Christie were products of their time, of course, we know that. They reflected the social values that were common in mid-19th century America and the first half of the 20th century in Britain. Twain's only interest in 19th century Palestine was biblical, and Christie's main interests in the Middle East were archaeology and tourism. Neither of them were engaged around the modern Middle East. So inevitably, we read them today and we contrast their values with our 21st century UU values, and find that these authors would be considered inappropriate in some ways today. It may not be reasonable at all to judge Twain and Christie by modern values, but it is significant that they both remain highly influential among readers of Western literature, and therefore they do continue to shape our perspectives of the Middle East today. Well, that's all I have to say, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robin. It was wonderful.
Okay, this is Miriam, excuse me, Nicole. I am going to try to unspotlight Robin so that we can, I don't want to, okay, we're gonna stop sharing.
Oh, good.
And,
Here we go.
well, and then so people will need to unmute themselves if they want to ask questions. There are no questions in the chat. Does anybody else have any questions?
When was the last time you went there to the Middle East, Robin?
I went on a research tour of some Crusader sites in Jordan in 2015. I had done a lot of archaeological work at these sites in the past, and I wanted to basically take a lot of measurements and photographs and check things. And I brought my nephew along to carry my luggage, and that was great. So, but my travel days are over. I've really retired from airports and airplanes.
Sally has a question.
Right. I don't know what imperial feminism is. Could you answer that?
Yeah, I think when people refer to Agatha Christie is an imperial feminist, they mean that the peoples of the empire are represented as strong, independent women, but that the local people who are not part of the empire are not of interest to the writer. So that's just a phrase that has been used.
You know, it's interesting that what Mark Twain wrote about the horrible way American tourists, actually other tourists, visit different countries is pertinent to nowadays. In fact, I have a photography that I took of a very old stone statue in a church in Paris, written with a variety of graffitis
Right.
in variety of colors.
Well, I noticed in 2015 when I was in Petra in Jordan, there was all this graffiti written in Western alphabet, but also in Arabic and Hebrew, whatever. It's that kind of vandalism is becoming a huge problem at archaeological sites.
But it's not only Westerners, because I remember going to Japan and visiting some Christian friends there, and they boasted of a variety of stones and ornaments that they had brought back from, they brought stone back from Mount Sinai, and I even joked that it will become plain Sinai pretty soon if they continue digging and taking things.
People do that. They do that. And there's no way to protect all these archaeological sites.
I have just an observation that I made as a longtime reader of Agatha Christie novels, as I mentioned just before your talk. One observation I made was, in any novel that she writes, watch the physician. No, no matter how insignificant he appears, don't trust him.
Yeah. Well, in Murder in Mesopotamia, she modeled the characters in the story after real archaeologists.
Okay,
That led to all kinds of uproar.
I mentioned specifically physicians. I don't know what you had against them.
Yeah.
Was Hercule Poirot modeled after an archaeologist?
I don't think so, but I don't know very much about him other than as a character in her books. I mean, she represents him just as a detective, and he shows up in her Middle East mysteries as he does in many of her other books. So if you're a fan of his, you might enjoy looking at some of these books.
Well, thank you, Robin. Nicole,
Yeah.
did you have any closing
Well,
words?
we really enjoyed your presentation. I thought it was wonderful, and it brought us a lot of information we didn't know, and it gives us food for thoughts, for further thought, actually. And one thought I have, which I never thought about it before, is about the women archaeologists of that time, or women who accompanied their husbands
Well,
at the
actually,
leakies. And
Actually, I'm 1 degree separated from Agatha Christie in that I was friends with a very close friend of hers who was, and at the time that I knew her in the 1980s, she was quite an elderly British archaeologist. She was very famous. She still is. I mean, she's no longer with us, but she's remains a very famous archaeologist. And she worked with Agatha and Max. And they're actually women have always been involved in Mediterranean and Near Eastern archaeology. From almost the very beginning, there have been many women archaeologists, which is made it very easy for people like me.
Well, thank you very much. And I hope you come back. You'll have, I'm sure you're going to have some other presentation. And
Oh.
we enjoyed a previous one too, but that was in person,
Yeah, that
in
was.
church.
Yeah, well, it's really nice to see all of you too.